Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we're going to be looking at Johnny's grounds of appeal. So he has officially lodged his appeal with the Court of Appeal. Initially, he asked for permission directly from the trial judge himself, Mr. Justice Nicol, and permission to appeal was not granted. So Johnny then applied directly to the Court of Appeal. Before we start off with today's video, I do want to say that if you've watched my video analyzing the judgment, in which I presented my own arguments in relation to what was wrong with it, this video will probably sound incredibly familiar to you. And that's because the arguments that I put forward are identical to the arguments that have been put forward by Johnny's team. So it's not deja vu, it's just that we are once again on the same page. In this case, Johnny is the appellant and NGN are the respondents, because Johnny is the one who is lodging the appeal and NGN will be responding to it. To start off, let's look at the grounds of appeal that are being put forward by Johnny. The grounds of appeal that are being relied on are as follows. Now, you've heard this one before from my analysis, which is that the trial judge's findings were basically assertions or assumptions rather than reasoned decisions that have been made after a careful and reasoned analysis of the evidence that has been presented by both sides. So Mr. Justice Nicol either didn't give any explanation at all or didn't give a proper one as to how he reached these serious findings despite the evidence that has been presented by Johnny's side. So if you'll remember from the start of the trial, Johnny's team submitted that because of the seriousness of the allegations, the evidence provided by the other side to meet the burden of proof to satisfy the defense of truth must be compelling and cogent evidence, which of course we know was not the case in this trial. The second ground of appeal is that the trial judge failed to test Amber's oral evidence against contemporaneous documentary evidence or the evidence that has been provided from numerous independent and professional witnesses. So here, of course, Johnny's team are referring to the mountain of evidence that existed and that was presented at trial, which completely contradicted Amber's oral testimony. And examples of these are the infamous audio recordings where she admitted to being the wrongdoer rather than Johnny, and all she accused him of doing was running away. And then, of course, the testimony that was provided by professional, trained police officers and the building staff at the Eastern Columbia building. And both of these groups of people had no allegiance whatsoever to Johnny. They further argue, and we're still on the second point here, that the judge reached conclusions on the evidence which were outside the bounds of a reasonable finding, particularly when you consider how implausible a lot of Amber's evidence was. So he arrived at conclusions that were completely unsubstantiated and implausible, almost difficult to believe. For example, she alleged that she was injured and that her nose was broken and her ribs were bruised and she had bruises under her eyes. And then there was evidence from a nurse that completely contradicted Amber's evidence, and yet the judge decided to ignore a medical professional's evidence, her contemporaneous notes, in favor of Amber's oral testimony. The third point is that the trial judge failed to examine or properly assess Amber's credibility or that of the other principal witnesses on behalf of NGN. They say that it seems that the judge accepted from the very beginning that Amber must have been correct in her allegations. Because of this, he discounted any evidence to the contrary, even going as far as to attribute to her evidence which she didn't even give, in order to cater for the obvious weakness or improbabilities in her evidence. So in other words, not only did he believe her word over that of everyone else and over the other documentary evidence as well, he filled in the gaps for her. When there were gaps or areas that didn't make sense or didn't add up, he helped her by supplementing her and coming up once again with his own assumptions and assertions in order to make her account more plausible and credible. The fourth ground of appeal relates to the judge's finding that one of Amber's allegations that were made in private were not found to be true. And the ground basically asserts that he failed to consider the impact of this finding. He didn't talk about how this finding could impact the rest of her allegations and could impact her credibility as a whole. Because the argument here is, if you found that she lied in relation to an incredibly serious allegation, what then makes you think that she is telling the truth with regards to the other allegations? You never talked about how this finding impacted your assessment of her evidence. The fifth ground of appeal is that the trial judge failed to closely examine and provide a proper assessment of the grounds that have been presented by Johnny to challenge Amber's credibility. The sixth ground of appeal is that the trial judge made no findings that Johnny or any of his witnesses were dishonest. Even though when you consider the fact that he dismissed the claim at the end, that's basically him saying between the lines that he didn't believe Johnny and his witnesses. But he never said that expressly in his decision, and judges do say that. They talk about how they didn't believe or didn't buy someone's evidence. They just didn't find them credible. The judge didn't really outright say that in this instance. So despite this obvious and fundamental flaw with the judgment, the trial judge failed to give any reason or any real reasons as to why he didn't accept their sworn testimony. And if you'll remember from my analysis, he placed such an emphasis on the fact that Amber's testimony was given under oath, and that's why he believed her. But he didn't apply that same reasoning to the evidence that was presented by Johnny or any of his witnesses. And finally, the seventh ground of appeal relates to the evidence that was meant to be presented by Officer Haddon from LA. Now, in the trial, if you'll remember, only Officer Sains was called upon to be cross-examined. But Officer Haddon was not, and the respondents, NGN, chose not to call him, even though they were the ones who summoned him to provide oral testimony, to be cross-examined. So because he was never cross-examined, his evidence was unchallenged. And so this ground of appeal is a bit more technical. I'm going to try to explain it the best way I can. They refer to Section 4.1 of the Civil Evidence Act. So this section essentially states that when it comes to hearsay evidence in civil proceedings, the court will consider any circumstances which can affect the weight to be attributed to the evidence. And then subsection 2 goes on to list examples of the considerations that can impact the weight that is attributed to the evidence. So this is basically telling the court that you can consider things that can impact the reliability of this evidence. And the reason they're bringing this up is because the trial judge failed to consider Officer Haddon's deposition, which is an out-of-court statement. So the judge is saying, it's a hearsay statement. I'm not going to attribute any weight to it pursuant to Section 4 of the Evidence Act. But again, here they're arguing you can't do that because technically it's not really falling under that anymore because he was there and he was willing to provide testimony and willing to be cross-examined. They then move on to talk about the reasons for granting permission, which is very important. This is the aspect where the Court of Appeal is going to be convinced or not. So first they state that Johnny has at least a reasonable prospect of success, which is in accordance with the test for granting permission to appeal. And we've talked about this before in my appeals video. Part 52 of the Civil Procedure Rules in the UK specify that in order to grant an appeal, the appellant must have a reasonable prospect of success. They then go on to talk about how they will be providing the Court of Appeal with examples of why Johnny has at least a reasonable prospect of success. And this is the document that we're going to start looking at next. Now, everything will be linked down below. In fact, Nick Wallace's website will be the only link because that's where I have sourced all of these documents. So you can read them in your own time if you haven't already. I know a lot of you have. And in fact, a lot of you have pointed out to me how similar, if not identical, the arguments made by Johnny's team are to the arguments I made in my video. So as usual, I do tend to paraphrase, summarize. It's just my style. It's something you pick up both by being a lawyer and in the military. So if you really want to get into the details, feel free to read the documents for yourselves. They're actually written very well. They conclude the grounds of appeal by stating that in addition to the examples as to why Johnny has a reasonable prospect of success, there are other compelling reasons for permission to appeal to be granted. Firstly, this was a very public judgment reached by a single judge, rather than a jury, for example. And it made devastating findings of extremely serious allegations, and that this has a far wider ranging implication for the public at large, particularly for people in Johnny's shoes, so victims or people who have been wrongly accused. So here they're alleging it would be in the public interest, essentially, to grant this appeal, because it's not just going to impact Johnny. The implications are far-reaching. All right, so now we're going to move on to the skeleton argument, which goes on to list all of the examples that they wish to rely on in order to convince the Court of Appeal to grant them permission to appeal. Now, you'll remember from my video that I said that Mr. Justice Nichols' judgment was absolutely devoid of any judicial reasoning whatsoever, and it was just a bunch of assertions. And this is once again echoed by Johnny's team here in this paragraph, as you can see. The judge conducted no analysis of the evidence or the credibility of the witnesses. He also failed to explain his reasons for his findings, which are simply asserted. They also focus on Amber's inconsistency. So the number of allegations perpetually increased, and the nature of the allegations also changed. And I remember reading this in his judgment. He dismissed the inconsistency and basically excused her for being confused and she'd been through a lot. And that's an example of Mr. Justice Nichols filling in the blanks for Amber to make her story more plausible. He's basically justifying her inconsistencies on her behalf. They once again talk about how Mr. Justice Nichols accepted at the outset that Amber must have been correct in her allegations and then discounted any evidence to the contrary, even attributing to Amber evidence which she didn't give, and thereby bolstering her evidence. This, they argue, is a compelling reason as to why his findings are unsafe. Mr. Justice Nichols took little to no account of the striking examples of Amber's willingness to lie or commit wrongdoing, which of course reflect on her reliability as a witness. If you remember from my video talking about the very similar case in the UK in which the appeal was successful, the Serafin case, I was told how to pronounce that in the comments. I hope I'm doing it right by the Polish community. But essentially, I made reference to how the Court of Appeal noted in that case that they are usually very reluctant to interfere in findings of fact. But they will do so when it is one of those rare cases where it is absolutely justified. And so here, Johnny's team are saying that Mr. Justice Nichols' conspicuous failure to analyze the evidence with the care that the parties were entitled to, and which a proper resolution of the issues demanded, justifies the Court of Appeal intervening in the decision, notwithstanding its general reluctance to disturb the findings of a trial judge. And then in paragraph 8, they state that the Court of Appeal is not asked to substitute its own decision, but rather to set aside the judgment and order a new trial. And then they state that Johnny did not receive a fair trial in accordance with Articles 6 and 8 of the Convention. And the convention that they're relying on here is the European Convention on Human Rights. Then Johnny's team start to talk about the approach that Mr. Justice Nichols should have taken. They state that in cases of he said, she said, essentially, which this case was, the credibility of the witnesses is key. Where the outcome of a case depends heavily on the oral evidence of a witness, a judge must carefully consider and analyze the quality of the evidence, meaning the witness's ability to recollect events, consistency, and truthfulness. Contemporaneous documents are also an important indicator of the truth, and a trial judge should make findings of fact based upon inferences drawn from documents and known or probable facts. The contemporaneous documents here, of course, being the recordings, text messages that Johnny sent to his team telling him to save him and to extract him out of a situation with Amber. All of these are meant to be taken into consideration. And that was one of my major problems when I talked about this judgment in my video. You can't just discount evidence simply because it's out of court evidence. Just because something is not said or made under oath, that doesn't mean it is completely unreliable. I've seen judges heavily rely on such contemporaneous external evidence as opposed to solely relying on the testimony of a witness. Because these judges clearly understand the concept of perjury, something which I believe Mr. Justice Nicol doesn't quite grasp, which is very bewildering indeed. They go on to cite precedent that if a trial judge disregards important documentary evidence, he or she should give clear reasons for doing so and for preferring conflicting oral testimony given by a witness at trial. The only reasons that Mr. Justice Nicol gave, and he kept repeating these reasons, is that Amber's testimony was made under oath. He never stated why the recordings and the text messages were completely unreliable. In fact, as you'll remember from my analysis video, he cherry-picked. He decided that whatever was in Amber's favor would be considered, even if it was out of court. And this includes audio recordings and text messages and emails. But if anything was to be in Johnny's favor, it was automatically disregarded and completely undermined as a reliable source of evidence. Here they state that a trial judge must address the challenges that have been made against a witness's reliability and credibility in sufficient detail. This involves testing the strength and weaknesses of that testimony. The judge did none of this. Again, I feel like I'm a broken record at this point because I'm just repeating my analysis video. All of the evidence that was presented, including by Kevin Murphy, Kate James, Johnny's security detail, if it ever contradicted Amber, it was just cast aside. It was never examined sufficiently. He never took it seriously that these people all contradicted her evidence. In fact, he ended up saying they're all loyal to Johnny, or in the case of Kate James, he said she's a disgruntled ex-employee, which is of course insufficient. You can't just assume that these people are biased. You can't just assume that they are disgruntled ex-employees. You need to examine this challenge and then make an informed and reasoned decision. In relation to a trial judge's assessment of the credibility of a witness, the following 3 tests should be utilized as a useful pointer as to where the truth lies. Firstly, the consistency of a witness's evidence and what is agreed or clearly shown by other evidence. So, the consistency between Amber's evidence and the other evidence, including the oral testimony of other witnesses and the external out-of-court contemporaneous documents. Amber failed this test. Secondly, the internal consistency of the witness's evidence. So essentially, is she deviating from her own evidence? Is her evidence that she is providing consistent throughout? And again, Amber fails this test. And then finally, the consistency with what the witness has said on other occasions. This one differs from the second one, even though they do sound the same, the 2 tests. But the second test was really more in relation to a person's oral testimony. Is it consistent while they are testifying, or are they just all over the place? And then this third one is more their evidence in relation to other occasions, maybe outside of court. Is it consistent throughout? So because she failed all 3 of these tests and was still found as a credible witness by Mr. Justice Nicol, clearly he didn't even take these tests into consideration. The next point is very important. A judgment need not address every item of evidence or submission, but it must explain the conclusions. The judgment must demonstrate that a proper analysis was undertaken and the inherent probabilities were considered. If the judgment doesn't do this, the fairness of the trial process is undermined. The failure to give adequate reasons, example, why the account of one witness was preferred to another, or why evidence was rejected, may give rise to a freestanding ground of appeal. And the judgment, in this case, fails that test. And of course, we all know that no reasons were given. They're just a bunch of assertions. The only reasons I can think of are Johnny's team is biased. And I'm not saying those are legitimate reasons. I'm saying those are the only reasons that have been provided by the judge. Now we get into the list of examples, and this is where it's a lot to get through, and quite frankly, it's not something that you haven't heard before if you're a regular on my channel or if you've watched my analysis video. So because of that, this is where I will start kind of just picking out highlights. And as I said, if you want to read everything in detail, feel free to do so. Everything is linked down below. So first, they focus on the lack of reasoned decision-making, the failure to test the evidence, and the failure to test the credibility of witnesses. And as I mentioned before, examples of these contemporaneous documents are audio recordings, text messages, medical notes from medical professionals completely contradicting Amber. So for example, when she was noted as a jealous person who was very insecure whenever Johnny was away, it was clear as day, written by Nurse Erin. I believe it was Nurse Erin. And then Amber on the stand said, no, she got that wrong. I meant Johnny was jealous. And then the judge said, well, I guess the nurse was wrong then. I'm going to take you for your word, Miss Heard. They then mentioned the photos that were taken of Amber on the set with Keith Richards and Ian McLagan, where she is clearly blemish and bruise free, and her face is absolutely fine, clear as day. And the judge still decided to ignore this photographic visual evidence in favor of her testimony, even though by the time she testified, it was over 7 years since that photograph was taken. So of course her memory wasn't going to be perfect. Now, if you'll remember from the analysis video, or if you've read the judgment yourself, the judge didn't believe her 3-day hostage situation. He said, clearly you were free to go in and out. But then he went on to believe everything else, which makes absolutely no sense. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he then ignored the contemporaneous evidence, the secret recordings that were made in the house in Australia, in which you can hear Jerry Judge talking, Dr. Kipper, the nurse with him, I think it's Debbie at that point, everything that matched up and corroborated Johnny's evidence, Johnny's account, and completely contradicted Amber's account. This is problematic because if you don't believe her hostage allegation, then how did that not impact her credibility at all in your eyes? In fact, this is the incident where he says it must have been terrifying. You know, what Amber allegedly went through. It's just one of these situations of make it make sense. That's kind of my catchphrase this year. Make it make sense. And then they make an excellent point where they say Amber photographed the damage that was done to the house in Australia, but she failed to document anything that may have been inflicted on her actual person. So to her, apparently, it's more important to take a photo of a damaged lamp rather than her feet that were allegedly cut. And this is a recurring theme. She's always said, I've documented everything that Johnny did to me, except where is the evidence? Where is all of this documentation? All we see are random, graffiti messages that Johnny either wrote in a golden Sharpie or with paint on the wall, but we don't see any of the serious documentation because it never happened. She never took photos of them, and it doesn't make sense. Usually when a victim wants to document things, they wouldn't just document the physical damage. In fact, I believe the physical damage done to property would pale in comparison to whatever damage may have been inflicted on their own person. And then they talk about the James Corden, or pre-James Corden incident rather, which I've talked about at length. But basically, if you'll remember, the judge completely ignored a nurse's contemporaneous notes upon examining Amber, that there was nothing wrong with her other than, a scabbed lip, which by all accounts, she has very dry lips, which tend to bleed sometimes. The judge dismissed that note because it was a cursory inspection. Oh, the nurse was in a hurry. She was on her way out to see another patient. She couldn't see all of the things that Amber alleged happened to her, even though they would be incredibly difficult to miss. As Johnny's team say, if Amber was actually telling the truth, it would have alarmed even a stranger. It is implausible that her private nurse and friend would have missed them. And then, of course, we see her the next day on a talk show, making incredibly exaggerated facial expressions, that would be otherwise impossible if what she had claimed was true. And then we get to the best part. I suppose the part that always makes me laugh out loud in disbelief, because I did it again while I was reading the skeleton argument. You know that I did it when I was reading the judgment. It's one of those situations where if you don't laugh, you have to let something out, ignoring the evidence of trained police officers simply because they failed to take contemporaneous notes. And apparently, I'm not too familiar, let me know if you're a resident of LA, apparently they only take notes if there's something worth noting in the sense that something actually occurred. But because in Amber's case, nothing happened, they didn't note anything. I mean, they did. They wrote that she was basically refusing to cooperate, I believe. I think that was their note. So it's not like they didn't write anything. But Officer Sains was there on video link, testifying. She was cross-examined, and she never deviated from her account. Ever since 2016, her account has always been exactly the same. Nothing was wrong with Amber, and the property was not destroyed. When a judge decides to completely discount such evidence, I cannot explain it. It's not something that can be explained. It's implausible. I mean, that in itself is a sufficient ground of appeal, in my opinion. The complete disregard of objective, credible, reliable evidence that has been given by a professional. So in some sense, it's expert evidence. This is evidence from people who are trained in the area, not just a regular police officer, not just a neighbor. This is a trained person in the area. And then, of course, they also talk about how the staff at the Eastern Columbia building were completely disregarded and deemed to be unreliable, simply because they may have gotten the dates mixed up, but that was really the only thing he could nitpick at. And when I say he, I mean Mr. Justice Nicol. He had an issue that Mr. Romero got the dates mixed up, and then he had an issue that Cornelius Harrell overestimated the amount of time he spoke to Amber. So instead of the 8 to 10 minutes he estimated, it was actually 2 minutes. So let's play devil's advocate here. Let's say it was 2 minutes. How does that change Mr. Harrell's evidence whatsoever? It doesn't take 10 minutes to properly examine someone's face. I can glance at you in 2 seconds if you're 2 feet away from me and determine whether you've got bruises, whether you've got makeup on, whether you seem happy and bubbly. It's not something that requires a protracted period of time. So I don't know what the judge is trying to play at here. This is another part where Johnny's team completely echo the arguments that I put forth in my video. And this is in relation to the credibility of Johnny's staff. Towards the end of my video, when I gave you my personal opinion, I said that essentially what Mr. Justice Nicol did was he attacked the character of Johnny's security detail because he insinuated that they would have just stood there and let Johnny do what Amber alleged to her in front of their eyes. So he's saying they support that behavior because they didn't intervene. But then Johnny's team actually go a step further ahead from me and say that if what Mr. Justice Nicol was saying is true, which is they were trying to protect Johnny's reputation and they didn't want a PR nightmare, then they would have intervened, because then Amber would have gone out to the public, or could have gone out to the public and told everyone what Johnny did to her, which would be a PR nightmare. I was asked to specifically talk about the Bahamas incident in which Tara Roberts provided evidence that supported Johnny. The judge did reach out to both parties to kind of elaborate on the relevance, I suppose, of this evidence or of this account, because the fact that Miss Roberts was called upon to be cross-examined, that automatically made this relevant evidence to consider. But the judge said that it wasn't a pleaded incident, so it wasn't one of the 14 incidents, which means he completely disregarded the evidence. Now, Johnny's team states that the judge's conclusion that Miss Roberts' evidence would have made no difference to his decision was not a reasonable one. Accepting Miss Roberts' evidence would inevitably have required the judge to consider Amber's account. So in response to the judge's attempt to get more information from both parties, which is not out of the norm, again, I've been specifically asked to comment on this. He didn't do anything wrong in that respect. There's nothing unusual about a judge reaching out to get more insight, like, hey, why do you want me to consider this? Like, he's giving both sides the opportunity to respond. So NGN's response was, actually, we don't want you to consider it. Just ignore Amber's account. But that, as Johnny's team very aptly pointed out, is not a sufficient or reasonable reason for the judge to then ignore all of the evidence pertaining to this incident. Tara Roberts' evidence was important. She was cross-examined. It wasn't just an out-of-court statement. Therefore, it was part of the proceedings. It was no longer irrelevant. And for him to say that it had no bearing on his decision is ludicrous. Here we have a witness who absolutely corroborates Johnny's account and absolutely contradicts Amber's account, and yet it was deemed irrelevant. And so Johnny's team state that this is another example of the judge failing to address evidence which was damaging to Amber's credibility. They then talk about how he failed to consider Amber's prior arrest, how he failed to consider the reality show TV segment, the video that was played out involving Whitney Henriquez, Amber's sister. And interestingly enough, they also talk about how Amber was watching Whitney as she testified. And I even flashed up a screenshot back in July when I was talking about this case as it was happening live. There was a screenshot I flashed up where Miss Eleanor Laws asked Whitney, why do you keep looking up at the gallery at your sister? And then Whitney goes, I wasn't. But Miss Eleanor Laws did that on purpose. She was trying to show the judge, hey, Whitney is not testifying freely and openly. She's testifying under the watchful eye of her sister, and she's terrified of her, which only serves to corroborate their account of the turbulent relationship between Amber and Whitney. And I really want to point out one line in paragraph 57, which is verbatim what I have said multiple times in my previous videos, which is that it was one rule for Amber and another for Johnny when it came to relying on or disregarding evidence. And if you're familiar with me in my channel, then you would have heard me say thousands of times, it's one rule, one set of rules for Amber and an entirely separate set of rules for Johnny. She has provided sworn testimony, therefore it is 100% credible. Any out-of-court evidence that supports her is reliable, and all of her witnesses, no matter the nature of their relationship with her, are credible. Whereas with Johnny, on all counts, the opposite approach was taken. With no justification, mind you, whatsoever. In the conclusion segment of the submissions, Johnny's team come up with a few more examples of how Mr. Justice Nicol filled in the gaps for Amber and attributed evidence to her that she never mentioned herself. One example that really stands out to me is her allegation that she put makeup on to cover up her bruises and that she would never be caught dead without makeup because of the paparazzi, with her being a celebrity, etc., etc. Despite the fact that multiple other witnesses, including a witness from her own side, I believe it was Miss Sexton, I'm not 100% sure, who said that Amber never wears makeup unless she's going to an event, the judge chose to not only believe Amber, but then he went further to explain her actions by saying that she wasn't ready at that point to be public with her allegations. So she was putting on makeup to keep everything under wraps. She never said that. It was never put forth. He entirely came up with it on his own. Again, he assumed. To conclude their arguments, Johnny's team once again mentions that his right to a fair trial as per Article 6 of the Convention has not been afforded to him. And in addition to that, his rights under Article 8 pertaining to his privacy have also been infringed upon. And that's it. There we have it. As I said, this is very similar and very repetitive in comparison to my analysis of the judgment. Johnny's team effectively did what I did, which was go through examples. They didn't go through every single allegation. They picked highlights and they used them to explain to the Court of Appeal or to demonstrate to the Court of Appeal why the judgment is flawed, which is exactly what I did in my analysis video, which is almost an hour long. So you'll forgive me if I kind of took a bit of a shortcut when it comes to this video. Now we wait for NGN's response, which should be filed within 14 days, I believe. And someone on Twitter asked me whether the Court of Appeal has to order a retrial as opposed to substitute the decision for their own. Rule 52.20 addresses the appeal court's powers, and subsection 2 states that the appeal court has power to affirm, set aside, or vary any order or judgment, refer any claim or issue for determination by the lower court, so they send it back to the lower court to determine a certain issue, order a new trial or hearing, which is what Johnny is seeking, and then there are other options as well. But this doesn't in any way say that the Court of Appeal is bound by what the appellant is seeking. The Court of Appeal may make any orders that it finds to be appropriate or justified. In terms of the likelihood of this being sent back for a retrial, I think because Johnny specifically has requested it, if his appeal is granted, then it is quite likely that it would be sent back for a brand new trial. It makes sense anyway, because courts of appeal usually don't like to hear evidence all over again. You know, they examine what the trial judge relied on. That's it for this video. Don't forget to let me know what you think. I don't know whether an appeal will be granted, but I will say that it is an incredibly solid set of arguments. Of course, people who are not the biggest fans will say I'm biased because I made the exact same arguments, and so of course I think they're strong, but I assure you that is not the case whatsoever. If I had never made an analysis video on my own, and if we didn't share identical arguments, I would still think that this is an incredibly strong set of arguments. I'm fairly certain that I won't be releasing a video before the new year, so I do want to take this opportunity to wish everyone a very happy new year. We have made it through probably one of the more difficult years in recent history. A lot of lives were lost this year, so we need to be thankful for the fact that we're still here and we're still breathing, and hopefully we're still healthy. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll catch you in a future video. Have a very happy new year.